Welcome to another change-making conversation from Baptist News Global. You're listening to a special podcast series titled Highest Power, Church and State, featuring writer, poet, and musician Rick Pidcock. Now here's Rick.
Today I want to explore a pattern I've been noticing, what I call rhymes of power. Different institutions may look unrelated. Politics, churches, media networks. But when you pay attention to who gets power, who gets ignored, who gets commodified, the same dynamics repeat. I'm currently working on a piece about power, abuse, and complementarian Christianity, and as I was researching it, I kept noticing something I see again and again in my reporting. Different stories that seem unrelated, but rhyme with each other. For example, last week I wrote a piece titled, SBC Influencer William Wolf Wants an America of White People, and then another piece titled, Why Are Evangelicals Freaking Out Over James Tallarico? On one hand, these are two very different stories. One about an extremist Republican's white supremacy, and another about a Christian Democrat who is being demonized for supposedly being Satan incarnate. But while these are distinct stories, they have thematic rhymes. For example, in the first piece, Wolf said he wanted to live in a country where his neighbors look like he and his boys. He said, quote, I want my boys to grow up in a country where they don't look like they're the foreigners here, unquote. In other words, Wolf feels more comfortable being around white people. In the other story, however, the one about James Tallarico, one might expect a completely different storyline related to race. Tallarico is in favor of immigration. He wants to make life easier for immigrants and values diversity. That's why he's being called Satan incarnate by those on the right. Yet, even though there is much to appreciate about Tallarico, he also defeated Jasmine Crockett in the Democratic primaries. And why is that significant? As I explored in the piece last week, Jasmine Crockett is a black woman, and she was dismissed by many progressive Democrats as being too loud, too angry, and too negative. It's the old witch in the woods trope that we explored in our previous episode of Highest Power, Church and State in my interview with Angela Harrington. But again, though the Democrats have very different views, policies, and behaviors than overtly racist Republicans like William Wolf, there's a rhyme in that white Democrats feel more comfortable with a smooth-talking white man like Tallarico than they do with a, quote, angry black woman, unquote, like Jasmine Crockett, and the result was that a lot of black Christians felt hurt because they felt invisible. Because so many progressive Christians were excited about Tallarico's public confession of Christianity and don't seem to notice the many black politicians and candidates who are just as open about their Christian beliefs. One of the ways we need to begin sorting through these power dynamics is to notice these rhymes. And one of those rhymes is what I'm exploring in the piece I'm working on right now for Baptist News Global. To begin exploring this rhyme, I'd like to share two reels from my interview last week in episode 108 with Laura Teen and Robert Peters of Grace. Here was Peters.
We are elevating men to power that are not worthy of that power. I would encourage folks, who don't have a journalistic or investigative background to certainly, follow these things, stay engaged and aware, opening up to not viewing things through a partisan lens, and maybe just reflecting for a moment, regardless of what your political party is, we are elevating men to power that are not worthy of that power. And so we need to stop it and be more engaged citizens in terms of what we're tolerating and who we're elevating power.
We were discussing the parallels between how we're responding to the Epstein files and how the church has responded to abuse within its institutions. And Peters said, we are elevating men to power that are not worthy of that power. He said, we need to be more engaged citizens in terms of what we're tolerating and who we're elevating to power. I completely agree with Peters here. But I'd like to add that the men we're elevating to power who aren't worthy of that power aren't simply limited to the political realm. And I know Peters would agree with me on this. Remember what John MacArthur said when he told Beth Moore to go home. He said that women pastors aren't seeking equality, they're seeking power. He said, quote, this is the highest location they can ascend to, that power in the evangelical church. In other words, to MacArthur, the pastorate is an ascension to power. Notice the rhyme. Just as men in politics consider their office to be an ascension to power, So do many pastors. So going back to my interview with Robert Peters and Laura Teen, here's what Teen had to say.
I think a term from Jennifer Fried that's really helpful, her term betrayal blindness, essentially indicating that, there's this collective refusal to see harm. And when we say the word refusal, sometimes it indicates like willfully refusing, and other times it's like it doesn't really affect me, so I don't have to worry about it. I do think we're seeing this in both the Epstein case and in the broader sense of what happens in church abuse cases, which is willful ignorance, if you will, at best case scenario. And on the other end, an absolute just refusal to acknowledge the issues at hand.
She says that in church abuse cases, we're recognizing willful ignorance at best case scenario, and on the other hand, an absolute refusal to acknowledge the issues at hand. Again, I completely agree. And I'd like to expand that idea a bit beyond simply church abuse cases to include the way many churches think about pastoral authority and power to begin with. Because as I see it, the willful ignorance and absolute refusal to acknowledge the issues at hand doesn't seem to begin at the moment an abuse case occurs. Instead, the willful ignorance and absolute refusal to acknowledge the issues at hand have been there the whole time. Specifically in relation to what Peters talked about regarding elevating men to power who aren't worthy of power. To illustrate this, I'd like to share some audio from Anand Giridharadas of the Substack The Ink. He's being interviewed by Terry Moran about a series of articles he's writing on the Epstein files. And the first thing he noted in these comments was how the Epstein network of power worked.
Some of these men, we know from the testimonies of these women, like Virginia Giuffre, engaged in the sex crimes with him, also raped children with him. But then there's a much larger number of people in these files and emails. And as I was reading through it, I think a lot of the press was like, it felt like was in a hunt for Donald Trump's name to show up, or like which bold-faced person could be caught as a pedophile. Now, I understand that. I'm not minimizing the importance of that. Like that's important. But as I was reading the emails, the coverage just seemed to be differ from what I was reading. I felt like what we actually got in this set of revelations was actually quite minimally instructive about how the sex ring worked, just because people don't email about sexual abuse. But it was highly instructive about how this larger network of power operated, about the wealth and power of the network and the way that operates, about patriarchy, modern patriarchy. Kate Mann, also on Substack, has written a brilliant piece about how there's a kind of modern patriarchy at work here, where the old patriarchy was about hoarding women and hiding women and treating women as scarce. Like you don't let your woman out of the house. You defend the virginity of your daughter, like that, like guarding, gatekeeping women, and stashing them as something precious and inviolable. And the new patriarchy, evidence here, she writes, is about the trading and fungibility and commodification of women and the shared bonding among men by the trading. And therefore women are not to be hoarded and kept virginal and treated as scarce, but actually to be traded. I think both are at play. I think there's a lot of old patriarchy here too, and we can get into that, the second chapter called Never Eat with Women. I think there's a hybrid here of like women as crypto and women as servile daughters-in-law. Like women are a commodity to be traded, but women are also, don't belong anywhere anything real and important is happening. Anyway, as I read through it, I felt I was seeing a culture.
He noticed how patriarchy shows up in different forms. In the old patriarchy, he says patriarchy hoards and hides women. And in the new patriarchy, he says it trades and commodifies women. So how might Christian patriarchy play into all this? Before we get into that, I'd like to share a more extended section of their conversation that comes a few minutes later.
There are connections in terms of the indifference of this Epstein class, the dehumanizations that it engages in, who it sees as people and who it doesn't. I think there are connections to be drawn. And so the latest installment this week, we looked at, I was going through the photos. I'd gone through the emails so much, I switched to the photos, and thousands of photos. and it's obviously women and girls everywhere because of the sex crimes investigation, except during mealtime. I noticed this really, really strange thing that as soon as there was a table, food, hors d'oeuvres, a main course, some red wine on a table, the women disappeared, Terry. Disappeared. You look through these photos, and this is just like how my brain works. I think I slightly like weird angle to some of these things. And I'm just looking at this like, there's women and girls everywhere in this world. Obviously, where are these women going anytime there's food served? And I think you and I have both traveled around the world a lot. Like, there's a lot of places in the world where this is actually how eating happens, right? Like the women make the food and the men folk eat it amongst themselves, talking about the world, and then the women like find leftovers later. But it's not particularly common in West Palm Beach or
The
Manhattan.
Ivy League or whatever.
Right. And so I spent a lot of time like, what is going on? Like, why are the women being evacuated from mealtime? And what I realized was these are guys. This is just like they don't see women as full people. And B, these are people, these are men who basically want a frictionless experience of the world. And they associate many different types of things with friction. Many unlike things are sort of smushed into likeness in their kind of contempt for friction. So I think women are like a woman, like a 40-year-old woman opposite you at dinner is the nightmare of these men. These men may act because a 40-year-old woman with opinions whose passport you don't have in a locker, an actual like grown woman with thoughts and opinions who can like leave and like come and go as she pleases and is free and is mature and has strength. Like these men were so terrified. Like they clearly organized themselves logistically to never be in the presence of such women. You do not see like 43-year-old women in the Epstein files. And I again tried to make the connection between the pedophilia at the heart of the story, the extreme behavior of some subset of these men who literally wanted and were drawn to raping children, small number of them. But it is really a larger culture of wanting power distance, this term that sociologists use, wanting power distance in all of your equations in life. For some very small number of men, that means pedophilia. For a larger number of men, it means, and I've known some of these guys, like only being comfortable at the table when it's like a guy's thing, that the women are kind of accessory. Women are for like fun time. Women are for the pool, but like not the dinner table, because the dinner table is for conversation, and conversation is two-way, and these guys don't want to hear anything women have to say. But I think it also goes into some of their policy views. These are guys who don't like friction, pushback, resistance in the economy. They don't like it in regulation. They don't like it in antitrust. And I spoke to Lena Khan, former antitrust kind of warrior under President Biden, Federal Trade Commission, who's obviously a young woman of color, the most aggressive antitrust enforcer in a generation. And I figured she's kind of lived different, and she had just this huge amount of wrath at her in those years. And a lot of people blame her for why Silicon Valley kind of turned away from Democrats towards Trump. And I asked her, and she's a good technocrat, but in her like modestly gloating way, she's like, I'm reading the Epstein files and I'm finding there's quite a bit of a Venn diagram between people who were in an actual pedophilia ring and circle and people who were like fighting me tooth and nail about antitrust. Like, what's that about? And I asked her, like, what do you think that is? And she was like, I think these are men who have an expectation of impunity, who have an expectation of deference, who have an expectation of not being told no, who are never not told no. And when they are told no by a regulator or by a sex crimes investigator or whoever else, they don't like it and they fight back. And again, this connection making is fraught and complicated, but I do think there are these kind of lines to be drawn. Because remember, these men with the same thumbs on the same phone were typing messages about antitrust policy 1 minute and then about cute girls, quote unquote, the next.
According to Anand, once the men are conversing around the table, the women are no longer present. Why? Because he suggests there's a power distance. The table is considered a guy's thing, where the men have an expectation of impunity. They're deferred to, and they're used to not being told no. And this is where we see an unbelievably obvious rhyme with the Christian patriarchy of complementarian churches and parachurch ministries. In complementarian churches, only men are pastors. Only men are elders. Sure, women can be seen in all kinds of pictures of church life, but when you get to the elder board table, the women disappear. It's where the men get down to talking business. And it's not limited to churches. Even complementarian parachurch ministries have the same problem. For example, let's take a look at perhaps the biggest one, the Gospel Coalition. On one hand, they have women around writing and producing content for them. For this piece I'm working on, I did a bit of a deep dive into their author section, and I found that 23% of their content creators are women. Then I took a sample of 150 random women who have written for them, and based on that sample, the average woman writing for TGC put out about 4.5 pieces. And of those pieces, almost half of them had a title that signaled that they were about women's roles in the home or the church. I would imagine that number would grow if I were to read all the pieces and see what they specifically got into. For example, one article was titled, "Why I Joyfully Submit to Male Church Leadership." And another one was titled, "Front Row Seat, Supporting Our Husbands." So women are essentially spectators, watching their men perform and cheering them on. The men are the real actors. The rest were about things like body image, emotions, abortion, with a small handful of articles being focused on theology. Also, the women skewed younger, in that 90% of them were younger mothers or of childbearing age, with just 10% being older women. So then I looked at the men and noticed the differences. 23% of their writers are women, 77% are men. And when you look at how often they publish, the average woman writes about 4 articles, the average man writes almost 17. So, about 4 times as many men are writing for TGC than women. And those men are averaging about 4 times as much content as the women. And while around half of the women's content is about their roles in the church and in the home, which we all know the Gospel Coalition believes is a role of submission to men, the men could write about all kinds of theological ideas. Also, while 90% of the Gospel Coalition women in the 150-person sample I took were young mothers or of childbearing age, only 67% of the Gospel Coalition men were. The men skewed much older than the women. There were plenty of powerful men with gray or white hair, and hardly any women. So the men are cast as powerful, aged, and wise, while the women are young, fertile, and promoting a certain view of women that just so happen to have to submit to men. So what happens at the Gospel Coalition's table of power? While the women disappear at the tables that the men in the Epstein files gather around, what happens to the women at the tables that the men at the Gospel Coalition gather around? The Gospel Coalition has 11 board members. They're made up of 11 men and 0 women. The Gospel Coalition has 41 council members. They're made up of 41 men and 0 women. And the Gospel Coalition has 15 council emeritus members. They're made up of 15 men and 0 women. So in total, those at the tables of highest power at the Gospel Coalition are made up of 67 men and 0 women. This is the exact same dynamic we're seeing in the Epstein files. In the old patriarchy, their purity culture hoards and hides women. But in the new patriarchy, they trade and commodify women by letting a few of them write a few articles, almost half of which keep women in their place, while most of the rest play into the patriarchal stereotypes about what women are really concerned about in life. And then when the real power decisions for the organization happen around their board tables, the women completely disappear. Here's Terry Moran once more.
Yeah, that is just fascinating, and the kind of original reporting and insight that you bring to this story and so many stories. And I just think it's incredibly valuable. I can't wait to read that installment. And I would just say one more thing as we come to a close here, and that's that I don't give them a pass. I don't give them a pass because they didn't know precisely what was going on. First, there was an atmosphere around Epstein. Everybody who went there and actually came out terrified or shocked described it. I think I've mentioned Sergey Brin, the founder of Google's ex-wife, who they went down to Epstein Island, 15 minutes. She says, "We are out of here. I know exactly what this place is about, and I'm gone." I don't think they're together anymore. But that awareness, you had to ignore. You had to ignore what was in front of you.
It's such an important point. We don't talk about all the people he obviously met who never met him again.
They could tell. They could tell.
I don't think Epstein had a black friend, by the way.
Oh. Yeah.
Think about this.
Yeah.
And may have been some of his choice, but I think it must have been a lot of black people's choice also. He was in a lot of networks. Like, it's so interesting. In this whole network, a lot of people were like, "No thanks, man. No thanks, bro."
Right. Because they could see it. Okay. And then even if they were blinding themselves, there was the fact of his conviction. And most of what you're reporting comes after his notorious conviction on one count. Everybody knew it was a bogus prosecution because there was so much more they could have done, but he got basically off scot-free. One conviction for soliciting prostitution from a minor, from a child. They still hung with him because even though they weren't involved in the sex crimes, this networking power, this networking life that runs the world right now, right? That Kushner is part of as he rakes in the bucks for his father-in-law and makes war at the same time, and God knows what else, plans for the next AI revolution or whatever. It's one blob. It's one blob that is connected. And Epstein offers us insight into it in a way that I would not have expected had it not been for this reporting. And I'm really grateful for it, truly.
Well, thank you. Thank you for reading it. It's we're keeping it all free and open to the public. So sign up at the Ink and you'll get we've published the first 2 chapters already, and chapter 3 will drop, maybe over the weekend or next week.
Great. Essential reading, essential reporting.
He says, don't give them a pass. And you had to ignore what was in front of you. This is exactly what Grace's Laura Teen said happens in these churches where abuse gets covered up. She said they either have willful ignorance at best, case scenario, or on the other hand, an absolute refusal to acknowledge the issues at hand. And Peters said, we're elevating men to power that are not worthy of that power. The men of the Gospel Coalition aren't empowering women. They're either hiding them or commodifying them. So while they may not be personally sexually assaulting women, there are rhymes here in that they are treating women with the same patriarchal dynamics that the men of the Epstein files treated the women and girls. And men who don't empower women are not worthy of power. As Anand put it, in the world of Epstein, it's a networking power that runs the world. Isn't that essentially what the Gospel Coalition is? A networking power that runs their world? Or as their About Us page puts it, a fellowship of evangelical churches or a collection of pastors shepherding the next generation of church leaders in line with TGC's foundation documents? The pattern isn't subtle anymore. The same dynamics show up in politics, in abuse scandals, and in complementarian ministries. Men hold the power, and women disappear when the real decisions happen. And if we keep pretending not to see that pattern, then we're doing exactly what Laura Teen warned us about, choosing willful ignorance. That's it for today. Thank you so much for listening. Please like, subscribe, and rate us on your favorite podcast platform, and we'll be back with another episode on Monday.
This has been another change-making conversation from Baptist News Global. The episode you've just heard is part of a special podcast series titled Highest Power, Church and State. Be sure to follow BNG daily at baptistnews.com and subscribe to get notifications about future episodes. Baptist News Global is a national nonprofit news service that is independent, free, and faithful. B&G is supported by readers and listeners like you. Learn more at baptistnews.com.
This episode was produced and edited by Mac Bowles of TKG Communications, LLC, Dallas, Texas.